What did it truly mean to prepare for a winter that could last 8 months? A winter so absolute that a single miscalculation in autumn could mean starvation by February. In the vast frozen reaches of the Siberian frontier, where settlements clung to existence like fragile embers in an endless night, survival depended not on courage or strength, but on something far more demanding: the quiet, relentless discipline of preservation. Tonight, we drift into that world where every potato mattered, where every jar sealed could mean the difference between life and a shallow grave beneath the snow. Before we step into this quiet journey through the unforgiving seasons of Siberia's early settlers, I'd appreciate a small gesture. Press the like button and subscribe to The Natural Earth, so these late-night passages into forgotten corners of the past will always find you. Leave a comment sharing where you are right now, what time shows on your clock, whether you're wrapped in the deep silence of midnight or just beginning your morning somewhere far away. Now let the lights soften around you. Perhaps turn on a gentle fan for that steady, calming hum, and let us settle into tonight's quiet exploration of how ordinary people faced the coldest test nature could offer. The story we're about to enter unfolds across the 18th and 19th centuries in isolated homesteads scattered across the Siberian wilderness, where families lived with an awareness that shaped every single day. Winter was not simply a season to endure, but a vast, patient predator that tested everything you knew, everything you prepared, everything you dared to hope would be enough. These settlers, pushed to the edges of the known world by circumstance or decree, found themselves in landscapes where the ground froze solid as stone by October and remained that way until May, where forests stretched without end in every direction, and where the nearest town might be a week's journey through snow so deep it could swallow a horse. You wake in the gray light of early October to air that bites at your face the moment you rise from your rough blankets. The cold has arrived weeks earlier than last year, and you feel it in your chest. Not pain, exactly, but a tightness, a warning that winter is already reaching toward you with skeletal fingers. Your small dwelling, built from logs chinkacked with moss and clay, offers little comfort, even now before the true cold descends. The single room serves as kitchen, workshop, bedroom, and storage space all at once. Its walls darkened by years of smoke from the clay stove that squats in one corner like a sullen animal. Outside, the landscape has begun its transformation into something harsh and unforgiving. The birch trees that seemed so bright and hopeful in summer now stand pale and skeletal against a sky the color of old iron. The ground beneath your feet has started to harden, losing the give of earth and taking on the resistance of something becoming stone. You step into the garden, if such a generous word can describe the small plot you've wrestled from the forest, and feel the frost crunching beneath your worn felt boots. The cabbage heads you've been nursing since spring sit heavy and dense in their rows, their outer leaves touched with ice crystals that glitter in the weak morning light. Each one represents weeks of work, preparing the soil, carrying water from the stream, protecting the tender seedlings from late frosts that can strike even in June this far north. Your hands, already roughened by months of labor, ache as you bend to begin the harvest. The cold seeps through your woolen mittens you've mended so many times. The original fabric is barely visible beneath the patches, and makes your fingers stiff and clumsy. You grasp the first cabbage firmly and twist, feeling the satisfying snap as it separates from its root, bringing with it a clump of frozen earth that you shake free before setting the heavy head aside. The work is methodical, repetitive, and endless. Each cabbage must be examined for rot, for insect damage, for any weakness that might cause it to spoil in storage and contaminate the others. A single bad cabbage, overlooked in haste, can ruin an entire barrel by spring. You move through the rows with practice efficiency, but your mind never rests from calculating. 12 cabbages so far, each weighing perhaps 4 or 5 lobius. Not as large as you'd hoped, but the summer was dry and you could only carry so much water from the stream. At this rate, you'll harvest perhaps 60 cabbages total, which must be divided among immediate use, fermentation for sauerkraut, and storage in the root cellar. The sun, when it appears at all through the heavy clouds, traces a low arc across the southern horizon. You've noticed how each day it seems weaker than the last, how the angle of light has changed, so that even at midday, the shadows stretch long and thin across the frozen ground. This is the light of a sun that is already abandoning you, withdrawing its warmth and leaving you to face what comes next alone. By mid-morning, your back has begun to protest, a dull ache that settles deep in your spine and radiates outward with each bend and twist. You straighten occasionally, pressing your hands against your lower back, and look out across your small domain. The garden slowly being stripped of its bounty, the pile of harvested vegetables growing beside the door, the forest beyond, pressing close and dark and indifferent to your struggles. The turnips come next, and they fight you. Their roots have driven deep into soil that is now more ice than earth, and each one must be loosened with a digging stick before you can pull it free. Your shoulders burn with the effort, and you feel the familiar twinge in your right wrist, the legacy of a fall 2 winters ago that never quite healed properly. Some turnips emerge clean and whole, their purple-white bulbs solid and promising. Others break as you pull, leaving half their mass still frozen in the ground, useless now, except perhaps for the few chickens you keep in a lean-to behind the house. You try not to think about how many potatoes you lost this way last year, how you and your husband sat in February darkness, rationing what remained, each meal a little smaller than the body wanted, a little less than what would truly satisfy. The carrots are easier, at least. Their slender forms slide from the ground, with less resistance, but they must be brushed clean of soil immediately before that soil freezes into an armor that will be impossible to remove later. Your fingers are numb now despite the constant movement, and you work by feel as much as sight, running your hands along each carrot to check for the soft spots that indicate rot beginning from within. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the sound of your neighbor's axe, a steady, rhythmic chopping that carries clear and sharp through the cold air. He is cutting firewood, as you should be, as everyone should be, because there is never enough firewood, never enough to truly feel secure against the months ahead. But the vegetables cannot wait, and so you make your choice, as you make 100 such choices every day, each one a small gamble against disaster. By noon, you allow yourself to stop, not because the work is finished, but because your body demands it. You carry an armload of cabbages inside and set them on the rough wooden table that dominates the center of your home. The fire in the stove has burned low, and you feed it carefully with birch bark and small branches. Larger logs are too precious to waste, except in the deep night when the cold becomes truly dangerous. You prepare a simple meal: black bread, hard and dense, made from rye flour mixed with ground bark to stretch the grain further. A small piece of salted fish caught in the summer and preserved in brine so strong it makes your tongue shrivel. Hot water boiled with a few dried herbs. You cannot call it tea exactly, but it warms your hands as you hold the wooden cup, and that is worth something. As you eat, you mentally inventory what remains to be done before the ground becomes completely impossible. The potatoes, perhaps 300 lb of them, if you're lucky, still wait in another plot beyond the garden. Each one must be dug carefully, checked for damage, and sorted by size and condition. The largest and healthiest will go into storage whole. The smaller or damaged ones must be used first before their flaws become fatal. The beets, ruby red and sweet, need harvesting. The onions must be pulled and braided, then hung in the driest corner of the house where air can circulate around them. There are still mushrooms to gather from the forest if you're quick. The heavy autumn mushrooms that can be dried and will add precious flavor and substance to winter soups. And then there is the root cellar itself, that hole in the ground that represents your family's best hope of surviving until spring. It needs inspection, repair, preparation. Last winter, you discovered too late that water had seeped in through a crack in the wooden lining, flooding the lowest shelf and ruining 2 sacks of potatoes that you'd counted on to carry you through March. You finish your meager meal and return outside, where the afternoon light has taken on the peculiar quality it holds in these latitudes. Bright, but somehow cold, as if the sun itself has become a distant, disinterested observer. The pile of harvested vegetables has grown, but so is the list of tasks that still await. The potato patch lies at the edge of the cleared land, where you and your husband spent weeks 3 summers ago, pulling stumps and rocks from soil that seemed determined to resist cultivation. You kneel in the frost and begin to dig with a short-handled spade, working carefully around each plant to avoid stabbing the tubers that cluster beneath the surface. The first plant yields 5 potatoes, decent specimens, brown-skinned and firm, each one roughly the size of your fist. You set them aside with a small surge of relief. But the next plant produces only 3 small potatoes, and one of them shows the telltale softness of blight beginning to take hold. You cut away the damaged portion with your knife, wondering if the rest of the potato is truly safe, or if the disease has already spread invisibly through its flesh. In 2 months, it won't matter. You'll eat whatever you have, diseased or not, because the alternative is worse. But for now, you still have the luxury of being selective, of trying to store only what will last. The work continues, plant after plant, row after row. Your knees are damp despite the layer of straw you've knelt on, and the cold has crept through your skirts and settled into your bones. Each potato gets examined with a thoroughness born of bitter experience. Firm ones to the good pile, any showing signs of damage or disease set aside for immediate use. Anything truly rotten thrown toward the forest edge, where it might at least feed the ravens. The sun drops toward the horizon far earlier than seems right, though you know it is only October, and the days will grow shorter still, terrifyingly shorter, until by December, The sun barely clears the horizon at all before sinking back into darkness. You work faster now, racing against the failing light, pulling up the remaining potato plants with less care, shaking them roughly to dislodge the tubers, trusting to luck and experience to find them all. When darkness finally forces you to stop, your harvest fills 3 large baskets, perhaps 200 dozalba of potatoes. Less than you'd hoped, but more than you'd feared. You haul them inside trip by laborious trip, your back screaming in protest, and heap them in the corner farthest from the stove, where they'll stay cool, but not freeze, while you prepare their final storage place. Your husband returns, just as you're finishing, his face red from cold and exertion. He's been in the forest since dawn, felling dead trees and hauling them back as firewood. Work that is absolutely necessary, but that leaves you without his help for all these other tasks. Neither of you speaks of the division of labor. It simply is what it is, determined by necessity and by customs older than your grandparents. He brings news from the forest. He saw signs of an early heavy snow coming, a certain quality to the clouds and the behavior of the birds that men who live close to the land learn to read like letters on a page. This means the work must proceed even faster, that tomorrow you must somehow accomplish even more than today's back-breaking effort. The evening is spent in preparation for the next day's work. You sort through the potatoes by firelight, separating them into piles by size and condition. The largest and most perfect will be your seed stock for next year. They must be protected above all else, stored in the very best part of the cellar, where temperature and humidity remain most stable. The next tier, good solid potatoes with only minor flaws, will be your primary food for the winter. The damaged ones, the small ones, the ones you don't quite trust, these will be eaten first over the next few weeks before their weaknesses can betray them. As you work, you cannot help but count and calculate. 3 people in your household: yourself, your husband, your young son sleeping now in the corner behind the hanging curtain. Roughly 6 months until the ground thaws enough to even think about fresh food. October, November, December, January, February, March, perhaps even April, this far north. 200 lb of potatoes, 60 cabbages, perhaps 30 lb of turnips, 20 lb of carrots. Whatever beets you manage to harvest tomorrow. How do you make these numbers stretch across half a year? How do you account for spoilage? For the inevitable losses to rot and mice, and simple bad luck? You've played this game before, this grim arithmetic of survival. You know that by February, the cellar will smell of earth and decay. That no matter how carefully you check, some vegetables will turn soft and putrid. You know that by March, you'll be eating things you wouldn't have considered food in October, scraping mold from cheese, cutting away the worst of the rot, and consuming what remains. The fermentation crocks stand ready in the corner, heavy ceramic vessels that your grandmother brought to Siberia. 40 years ago, when she was a young bride, sent east with her husband to settle new lands. Into these crocks, you'll pack the cabbages with salt, layer upon layer, pressing them down until their own juices rise to cover them. The fermentation that follows, the cabbage slowly transforming into sauerkraut over weeks and months, is half magic and half chemistry. A process you don't fully understand, but have learned to manage through observation and ritual. Salt is precious, almost as precious as the food itself. The small bag you purchase last spring at ruinous cost must be rationed carefully enough to properly preserve the cabbage and cure a few fish, but not so much that you run out before winter's end. There is a balance point, a perfect proportion you aim for each year and sometimes achieve. By the time you finally collapse into bed, your muscles have gone beyond pain into a kind of numb heaviness. Tomorrow will bring more of the same. More harvesting, more sorting, more carrying, more calculating, and the day after that, and the day after that, until either the work is done or the weather makes it impossible to continue. You lie in the darkness, listening to your husband's breathing slow into sleep, and you think about the root cellar. Tomorrow, before anything else, you must inspect it properly. The cellar is everything. Your bank, your insurance, your hedge against the malevolent whims of nature. It waits for you beneath the earth, just outside your dwelling, accessible through a low doorway that you must stoop to enter. The structure is simple. A pit dug perhaps 8 feet deep into ground that stays frozen year-round beneath a certain depth, lined with logs to prevent collapse, covered with a sloped roof of boards and earth to shed rain and snow. Inside, rough shelves line the walls, and the floor is covered with sand to absorb moisture and provide a place to bury root vegetables. The air in the cellar maintains a peculiar quality: cold but not freezing, damp but not wet, still and heavy and silent like the inside of a tomb. You've heard stories of cellars that collapsed, burying entire winter's provisions under tons of frozen earth. You've heard of cellars that flooded, or that somehow got too warm and caused everything to sprout or rot simultaneously. You've heard of mice finding their way in through gaps no wider than a finger, multiplying in the darkness, devouring everything stored there, while the family above suspected nothing until too late. These stories visit you in the moments before sleep, unwelcome guests that slip into your consciousness despite your efforts to bar the door. What if your cellar has developed a crack you haven't noticed? What if this winter brings temperatures so severe that even the cellar freezes solid? What if you've miscalculated, harvested too little, and by February, you're watching your child grow thin and quiet? Sleep, when it finally comes, is fitful and unsatisfying. You dream of endless hours of vegetables, of digging in frozen ground that yields nothing, of opening the cellar door to find it empty, shelves bare, your careful preparations vanished like smoke. The next day begins before dawn. Not that dawn means much anymore, with the sun rising so late and setting so early that the day feels like a brief interruption in the ongoing darkness. You wrap yourself in layers of wool and felt and make your way to the root cellar with a flickering oil lamp that costs precious fuel but cannot be avoided. The door opens stiffly, swollen slightly with moisture, and you descend the rough steps into the earth. The lamp throws wild shadows across the log walls, and you can see your breath misting in the cold air. The smell down here is distinctive: earth and wood, and something mineral, something ancient, the smell of the ground itself. You inspect each shelf carefully, running your hands along the logs, checking for any soft spots that might indicate rot in the wood. You examine the corners where walls meet floor, looking for the telltale scratches and droppings that would indicate mice. You study the sand on the floor, checking its moisture content, making sure it hasn't become too wet or too dry. The inspection reveals both relief and concern. No major problems, no disasters waiting to happen, but also no perfection, no guarantee. One shelf has developed a slight sag that worries you. It will need reinforcement before you load it with heavy sacks of potatoes. There's a spot near the door where moisture seems to be seeping through the log lining. Not enough to cause immediate problems, but something that could worsen as winter progresses. Your husband spends the morning making repairs while you return to the harvest. The beets come up more easily than the potatoes, their round shapes sliding from the loosened earth with satisfying pops. They're beautiful, these beets. Deep red glows that seem to glow even in the gray autumn light. Each one a small miracle of concentrated sweetness and nutrition. These will be stored with special care, layered in sand in the cellar's coldest corner. All winter long, you'll descend into the earth and retrieve them one at a time, brushing away the sand to reveal their ruby flesh. Boiled and sliced, they'll bring color to the monotonous browns and whites of winter meals. A reminder that the world once held brightness and variety. The onions are your last major harvest, and they come with their own peculiar challenges. Each one must be pulled gently to avoid bruising the bulb, then left to dry in the pale sunlight for several days before the tops can be braided together for storage. But you don't have several days. The snow your husband predicted could come at any moment. You compromise, spreading the onions across boards inside the house near the stove, where warmth will help them cure faster. The sharp smell fills your dwelling, making eyes water, but also bringing an odd kind of comfort. The smell of food, of provision, of having something put by. Over the next week, you fall into a rhythm that is both exhausting and strangely meditative. Each morning brings the same tasks: checking what's been harvested, sorting out anything that has deteriorated overnight, preparing the next batch for storage. Each afternoon means more work in the cellar, arranging and rearranging, trying to optimize every inch of space, every breath of cold air. The potatoes get buried in sand layer after layer, with the best ones positioned in the center, where temperature stays most stable. The cabbages not destined for fermentation are wrapped individually in cloth and stacked carefully on shelves. The carrots and turnips and beets find their places, each vegetable group separated from the others, to prevent cross-contamination of flavors and to make retrieval easier in the dark winter months ahead. You begin the fermentation process on a cold afternoon when your husband is again in the forest. The work is satisfying in its precision. Each cabbage quartered, the cores removed, the leaves sliced thin with your sharpest knife. Into the crock they go, layer by layer with salt, sprinkled between each layer. Not too much, not too little, but just the right amount that your grandmother taught your mother and your mother taught you. You press down hard with clean hands, compacting the cabbage, encouraging it to release its juices. More cabbage, more salt, more pressing until the crock is filled almost to the rim and brine has risen to cover everything. A clean cloth goes over the top, then a wooden disc, then a heavy stone to weight it all down. Now comes the waiting, the fermentation, the slow transformation that will preserve these cabbages through the winter. For the first few days, you must check it frequently, skimming off any foam that appears, making sure the brine level stays high enough. After that, if all goes well, the fermentation will proceed on its own. And by midwinter, you'll have sour, tangy sauerkraut that will provide crucial vitamins when everything fresh is just a memory. The first snow comes on a morning in late October. fat flakes drifting down from a sky the color of old putter. It's early yet, just a dusting that melts by midday. But you and your husband exchange looks that carry volumes of unspoken communication. The deadline has arrived. The remaining work takes on a frantic quality, though you try to maintain the same careful attention to detail. There are still herbs to gather and dry, hanging in bundles from the rafters where air circulates and they're safe from mice. There are still a few late mushrooms to collect from the forest, valuable for the flavors they'll bring to winter soups. Your husband brings home a hunch of elk that he traded for with a neighbor. Precious meat that must be either eaten immediately or preserved. You choose preservation, cutting the meat into thin strips, rubbing each piece with salt, hanging them in your tiny smokehouse, where a smoldering fire of green birch will cure them slowly over several days. The meat represents protein, represents strength, represents the possibility of maintaining muscle and health through the long months ahead. But it also represents risk. If the smoking doesn't proceed properly, if moisture remains in the meat, if the temperature isn't right, the whole hunch could rot and be lost. You tend the smokehouse fire obsessively, checking it every few hours through the day and night, adding small pieces of wood to maintain the thin trickle of smoke, adjusting ventilation by moving boards that serve as makeshift dampers. The smell of smoking meat fills the air around your homestead, and you know your neighbors are smelling it too, are making their own calculations about your relative prosperity or desperation. By early November, the real cold has settled in. The kind of cold that makes the air itself seem solid, that freezes your breath into ice crystals on your eyelashes, and makes the snow squeak and groan beneath your boots. The river that flows past your settlement has begun to freeze, ice forming in delicate shelves along the edges, reaching further toward the center each day. You descend into the cellar one last time before the deep winter, conducting a final inventory, a final check of your preparations. The shelves are full, but not overcrowded. You've learned that vegetables need space around them, need air to circulate, or they'll rot from contact and contagion. The sand on the floor is properly moist. The temperature hovers just above freezing. The smell is clean and earthy without any hint of decay. You count sacks and estimate weights, doing the arithmetic one more time. 200 lb of potatoes, 50 cabbages remaining after fermentation, 30 lb of root vegetables, the dried mushrooms, the smoked meat, the small stores of grain and flour you've managed to put by. Added to this are the occasional luxuries traded for or purchased: a little tea, some sugar, precious salt beyond what you've already used. The numbers say you should make it, should survive until spring. Should. But that word carries no guarantees, makes no promises. In the settlement records kept by the local Orthodox priest, her name appears in careful script: Praskovia Ivanovna, born 1791, married 1809, mother of 6 children. But the records cannot capture what made her remarkable, cannot convey the particular way she understood winter's mathematics, the instinct she possessed for measuring survival against the merciless advance of cold and darkness. She was born in a winter that nearly destroyed her family. Her father had been sent east as part of a resettlement program, one of thousands of peasants pushed towards Siberia's edges to claim land and establish Russian presence in territories that had known only indigenous peoples and the occasional Cossack outpost. The journey itself had been an ordeal that stretched across months. The family traveling in a creaking wagon alongside other settlers, moving slowly through landscapes that grew progressively more foreign and forbidding. Her mother had been pregnant during that journey, her belly swelling as the forests grew denser and the settlements grew sparer, until finally they arrived at their assigned land grant in late autumn, with barely enough time to construct shelter before the snows came. That first winter in their new holding, when Praskovia was barely 3 months old, the family discovered too late that their hastily constructed cellar had been built in ground that stayed too warm. The potatoes they'd stored there had sprouted by January, sending pale-seeking tendrils into the darkness, draining themselves of nutrition and substance. Her father had chosen the cellar site in desperation, needing to complete it before the ground froze completely, not yet understanding how the earth behaved in this new latitude. By February, her parents were boiling leather and feeding the family a thin giarl made from birch bark ground into flour, a substance that filled the stomach without truly nourishing it, that sustained life in the most minimal sense while the body slowly consumed itself. Her infant brother died in March, simply stopped breathing one cold morning, his small body already thin as a bird. Her mother never spoke of that winter, but Precia absorbed its lessons nonetheless, learned them somehow, in the wordless way children understand the great traumas that shape their families. The silence around that first winter became its own kind of teaching, a warning transmitted not through words, but through her mother's careful, almost obsessive attention to food storage in all the years that followed. She grew up watching her mother with fierce attention, mimicking her movements in the cellar, learning to read the subtle signs that most people overlooked. She learned to judge the firmness of a potato with her fingertips, to smell the difference between healthy fermentation and the beginning of rot. She memorized the feel of properly cured meat, the look of mushrooms that had been dried correctly, the sound snow made when it was about to become a serious storm. There were other lessons too, harder to quantify. The importance of beginning preparations early, when abundance made it easy to dismiss the coming scarcity. The necessity of maintaining storage spaces with religious consistency. The way that small oversights could cascade into catastrophe over the course of a long winter. Her mother checked their cellar every 3 days throughout winter, regardless of weather, regardless of how tired she was, and Praskovia accompanied her on these inspections from the time she could walk. By the time she married at 18, moving from her parents' homestead to her husband's family settlement 3 days' journey to the east, she carried with her knowledge that seemed almost supernatural to those who didn't understand its source. She could walk through a root cellar and know, simply know, whether the food stored there would last the winter or fall short by March. The journey to her new home took place in late autumn, the landscape already stripped and gray, preparing for winter's arrival. She traveled with her few possessions in a sledge, her husband, Mikhail, walking beside the horse, both of them mostly silent as they covered the distance between her old life and her new one. Her husband Mikhail was a trapper, a quiet man who spent weeks at a time in the forest pursuing sable and fox. This meant Praskovia managed the homestead alone for long stretches, making all the decisions about planting and harvest and storage without the consultation that other wives relied upon. She didn't mind the solitude, particularly found it suited her temperament in ways she hadn't expected. In fact, she found she preferred it, preferred making choices based on her own observations rather than deferring to a husband's judgment that might or might not be sound. Their first winter together tested her thoroughly, revealed the gap between her understanding and his. Mikhail had been optimistic in his preparations, had stored what he considered plenty, but what Praskovia's instincts told her was barely adequate. She said nothing, unwilling to criticize so early in their marriage, but she quietly implemented her own measures, stretching every meal a little further, finding ways to make their supplies last that her husband never noticed. She began taking smaller portions for herself, claiming she wasn't hungry, when in fact she was merely calculating, always calculating, how many more days they needed the food to cover. They survived that winter comfortably, and Mikhail believed his preparations had been sound. Praskovia let him believe it, understanding already that sometimes wisdom means allowing others their illusions, that pride could be a useful thing when managed correctly, when it motivated rather than endangered. The settlement where they lived consisted of perhaps 20 families, scattered across a valley where a tributary of the Yanis River provided water and a transportation route during the brief summer months. The families helped each other when they could, but resources were too scarce for much generosity, and there was an understood hierarchy of obligation. You helped your blood relatives first, then your closest neighbors, then others only if you had genuine surplus. Each household lived in a state of constant, quiet calculation, always measuring what they had against what they would need. The mathematics of survival were never simple, never certain. Too many variables, too many possibilities for disaster that could upset even the most careful preparations. Praskovia became known first for small things, for observations that seemed minor until proven correct. A neighbor woman asked her advice about whether certain potatoes were too far gone to store, and Presia looked at them and said yes, they would rot by January and contaminate everything near them. The woman stored them anyway, unconvinced, perhaps thinking Praskovia was being overly cautious or didn't truly understand how storage worked. In January, she found that Presia had been exactly right. The questionable potatoes had indeed rotted, and the rot had spread to everything on the same shelf, forcing her to discard nearly a quarter of her winter stores. Another time, a young couple newly arrived from Russia proper asked Praskoya to inspect their cellar before they filled it, having heard from someone that she had a good eye for such things. She descended into the earth with a candle, examined the construction, and pointed out a gap in the log lining where field mice would certainly find entrance, and possibly larger rodents as well. They sealed the gap with clay and stones, working for most of a day to make it secure. And that winter, they alone among the new settlers didn't lose stores to rodents. Word spread quietly, the way information travels in isolated communities, where everyone knows everyone else's business, where reputations are built on accumulated small proofs rather than dramatic demonstrations. Praskovia became someone people consulted, usually in private, often with a gift of thanks pressed into her hands. A few eggs, some wild berries, once a beautiful wooden spoon that she used for the rest of her life. She never claimed expertise or made a show of her knowledge, understanding instinctively that displays of superiority would breed resentment in a community where everyone's status was relatively equal. When people asked how she knew things, she would shrug and say she'd learned from watching, which was true as far as it went. But there was something more, something harder to articulate. A kind of sympathetic understanding of how preservation worked, how vegetables breathed and changed in storage, how meat cured, how fermentation could be managed or could go disastrously wrong. She seemed to possess an ability to extrapolate forward from present conditions, to see in August what would likely happen in February, to understand how small decisions would compound over time into either abundance or scarcity. It wasn't mystical, though some people treated it that way. It was observation and pattern recognition applied with discipline and without sentiment. The winter of 1825 brought her first real test as an informal leader, the first time her knowledge needed to serve more than individual families. Late spring frost killed most of the community's potato plants, the freeze coming in early June when the plants were still small and vulnerable, blackening the leaves and killing the roots beneath the soil. By August, it was clear the harvest would be catastrophically short, perhaps 60% of a normal year. The settlement held a meeting in the small wooden chapel, and the priest asked each family to estimate their stores, to declare honestly what they had, so the community could assess its overall situation. The estimates Praskovia could see immediately were dangerously optimistic, based more on hope than reality. People were counting things that wouldn't last, including vegetables that would rot early, failing to account for the inevitable losses to spoilage and pests, overestimating the nutritional value of what they'd preserved. She stood up in the meeting, which was unusual. Women generally didn't speak in such gatherings unless asked directly, unless the topic was specifically domestic, and therefore within their acknowledged domain. But she stood, and she said very quietly that if everyone was honest about what they really had, and if they pulled certain resources and managed them collectively, they could all survive. But only if they started rationing immediately in August, not waiting until scarcity became obvious. The men in the room looked at her with expressions ranging from skepticism to hostility, unused to hearing a woman's voice in matters of community governance. Her own husband looked uncomfortable, unaccustomed to having his wife speak so publicly, caught between pride in her knowledge and embarrassment at her breach of social convention. But the priest, an educated man from Moscow who had been in Siberia long enough to recognize wisdom wherever it emerged, asked her to explain her reasoning. Father Dimitri had seen enough winters to understand that survival sometimes required setting aside pride and convention, that intelligence had no particular gender, when starvation was the alternative. She did, laying out the mathematics of survival in terms even the most stubborn could understand. Speaking slowly and clearly, making her case with numbers and logic rather than emotion, she proposed that families with the best cellars and storage capabilities take in food from families with poorer facilities, holding it in trust and distributing it back as needed, preventing the losses that came from inadequate storage conditions. She suggested they establish a communal smokehouse where meat could be preserved more efficiently, where expertise could be shared and resources pooled. The current system, where each family maintained their own inadequate smoking setup, led to waste that the community could no longer afford. The discussion that followed was heated. full of suspicion and wounded pride and fear. Men arguing about property rights and independence while their wives sat silent, calculating in their own minds whether their families could survive alone. But in the end, enough families agreed to try Praskovia's system that it became the settlement's unofficial policy, adopted not through consensus, but through the simple mathematics of survival. That winter proceeded according to her predictions, unfolding with the grim inevitability she had foreseen. By November, families who had refused to participate in communal storage were already running low, eyeing their neighbors' supplies with poorly concealed envy, beginning to regret their proud insistence on independence. By January, 2 of those families were begging for help, arriving at the communal stores with thin children and desperate faces, their pride finally broken by necessity. The communal stores, carefully managed, were able to provide enough to keep them alive, though Praskovia made clear that the rations came with expectations. These families would need to contribute more labor to the collective next season, would need to acknowledge that their survival had been purchased by others' foresight. By March, when the settlement typically began to fracture under the strain of depleted supplies and cabin fever, when tempers grew short and old grievances resurfaced with the viciousness that prolonged hardship breeds, Praskovia's system held them together. The shared smokehouse meant families could trade labor for preserved meat, creating a network of obligation and reciprocity that bound the community more tightly than mere proximity. The communal storage cellars, managed in rotation by different families, meant that everyone knew how much food remained and could plan accordingly, eliminating the uncertainty and suspicion that came from not knowing whether your neighbor was hoarding while you starved. They all survived to see spring, though it was close in some cases, though by April they were eating things that barely qualified as food: the inner bark of certain trees, roots dug from partially thawed ground, anything that could provide even minimal calories. But no one died of starvation that year, which was more than many settlements could claim, more than several communities within a 100 miles managed. After that winter, Precia's role in the community became formalized in an unspoken way, her authority acknowledged without ever being officially granted. She was consulted on matters of food storage and winter preparation, not just by individuals, but by the settlement as a whole. When new families arrived, the priest would send them to Praskovia to learn the particular requirements of surviving winter in this latitude, in this climate, with these resources, understanding that her teaching was as essential to their survival as their physical strength or farming knowledge. She had 6 children over the years, 4 of whom survived infancy, 2 daughters and 2 sons, who grew strong and learned their mother's lessons. She raised them with the same attention to detail and preparation that she brought to food storage, understanding that survival skills needed to be transmitted across generations, that knowledge was itself a form of wealth in a place where material wealth remained perpetually scarce. They learned from their earliest years to waste nothing, to plan ahead, to respect the power of winter and the absolute necessity of proper preparation. Her children could estimate quantities with remarkable accuracy by age 7, could judge the quality of preserved food by age 10, could manage a cellar's contents independently by adolescence. Her daughters married into other settlements, carrying with them the knowledge their mother had given them, spreading Precia's methods across a wider territory. Her sons stayed close, building their own homesteads within a day's walk, and they would bring their wives to Precia each autumn for inspection of their winter stores, maintaining the ritual even after they'd established their own households and authority. The inspection became a ritual, anticipated and sometimes dreaded, but always honored. Praskovia would arrive at a homestead in late October, after the harvest was mostly complete. Veterans of Siberian winters recognized instantly a stillness in the air, a pressure change that made ears pop and dogs whine restlessly, pacing and pouring at doors as if they could escape what was coming. The snow began falling late one afternoon and didn't stop for 3 days, coming down so thick that you couldn't see your hand extended at arm's length. It was driven by winds that shrieked and howled and found every gap in every wall, that piled drifts against buildings until some structures were buried to their eaves, that made travel impossible and turned the familiar landscape into an alien, featureless white waste. The temperature dropped to depths that made the air itself seem like a hostile presence, eager to steal warmth and life from anything exposed to it. On the second day of the storm, the roof of the Vulov family's house collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow, the supporting beams finally giving way with a crack that sounded like thunder, sending tons of snow crashing down into the living space below. They managed to escape with their lives, but lost everything inside: their winter clothing, their cooking equipment, much of their stored food. Worse, the collapse had damaged their cellar entrance, and snow had poured into the cellar itself, flooding and freezing everything on the lower shelves, destroying vegetables and contaminating what remained with icy water that then froze solid, creating a chaos of ice and ruined food. When the storm finally cleared, Precia made her way through snow that came up past her knees to assess the damage, pushing through drifts that had transformed familiar paths into obstacle courses. The Vulovs had lost perhaps half their winter provisions, not quite fatal on its own, but enough to put them in serious danger as the weeks wore on. Enough that without help, they would certainly face starvation by March. She called another settlement meeting, this time in the Vulovs' temporary shelter in a neighbor's barn. The family huddled together for warmth while their neighbors crowded in to discuss their fate. The situation was discussed with the kind of frank clarity that emergencies sometimes permit, without the usual social niceties that might obscure the stark mathematics of survival. The Volkovs needed help, but every family's margins were thin this year, after the difficult harvest and the early winter. Praskovia proposed a rationing system for the entire settlement, an expansion of the communal storage model they'd used before. Each family would contribute a small portion of their stores to support the Volkovs through the crisis. The amounts were calculated carefully enough to make a real difference to the family in need, but not so much that it would endanger the donors. A delicate balance that required knowing each family's exact stores and needs. Some families objected, arguing that the Vulovs should have built a stronger roof, should have been more careful, that their misfortune was somehow their own fault, and therefore not the community's responsibility. Praskovia listened to these objections and then said simply, "It could have been any of us," her voice carrying a weight that came from years of managing survival on the edge of catastrophe. The snow load was unprecedented. The storms had been unpredictable, and assigning blame served no useful purpose. Next year, it might be a different family facing catastrophe through no fault of their own. And when that happened, they would hope for the same generosity they were being asked to show. Now the argument was persuasive, or perhaps it was just that people had learned to trust Paskovia's judgment, had seen her be right too many times to doubt her. Now the rationing system was implemented, and the Vulovs received enough to survive, though their diet that winter was meager, and their situation remained precarious until spring, their children thin, and their prospects uncertain. But the storm had revealed another problem, exposing vulnerabilities that the community hadn't fully recognized. When Praskovia made her round to collect the contributions, she discovered that 2 other families had also suffered significant damage, though not as dramatic as the Volkovs' collapsed roof. The Karpov family's cellar had developed a leak, water seeping in from somewhere, freezing, expanding, cracking the log lining, and allowing more water to enter in a destructive cycle. The Belov family had lost their smokehouse to the wind, the structure simply torn apart by the sustained force of the storm, and with it all their preserved meat, months of work, and precious protein scattered across the snow. The cumulative effect of these disasters meant the settlement as a whole was in more danger than anyone had initially realized. Their collective buffer of stored food, the surplus that should have carried them comfortably to spring, had been eroded by a combination of poor harvest and storm damage, leaving margins that were dangerously thin. Precia spent a sleepless night doing calculations, moving quantities around in her mind like pieces on a game board, trying to find a configuration that would work, that would keep everyone alive. In the morning, she went to the priest with a proposal that was both radical and absolutely necessary, that would require the community to trust her more completely than ever before. They would need to centralize food storage even more completely than before, consolidating everything into the few cellars that had proven most reliable. The best cellars would hold everything, with strict accounting and regular distribution. A system that would give her and a few others complete control over the community's food supply. Families would receive weekly rations based on size and need. No more hoarding, no private reserves, beyond a few days' worth. It meant surrendering control, meant trusting the collective more than most people were comfortable with, meant accepting that your survival depended not just on your own preparations, but on the honesty and competence of others. It meant that families who had prepared carefully would have to support families who perhaps hadn't, which violated the deeply held principle of individual responsibility that governed frontier life. But Precia argued that it was their only chance. Together, they had enough. Separately, some of them would certainly starve, and she was willing to stake her reputation on this assertion. The priests supported her, which gave the proposal legitimacy, Father Dimitri's endorsement carrying weight that her words alone might not have. One by one, families agreed, though some required more persuasion than others, some needing to see the mathematics laid out in detail before they would accept that their individual autonomy needed to be sacrificed for collective survival. By December, the new system was in place with Paskovia and 2 other women managing the central stores and distribution, a triumvirate of survival. The responsibility weighed on her heavily, settled on her shoulders like a physical burden that she carried constantly, even in sleep. She understood that she was now personally accountable for the survival of more than 100 people, that every decision about how much to distribute, every calculation about remaining supplies carried the weight of life and death. Every mistake she made, every miscalculation could mean that someone starved, a child, an elder, a mother or father whose death would ripple through families and across generations. She checked the cellars obsessively, descending into the cold earth every few days to turn vegetables, to remove anything showing signs of spoilage, to monitor temperature and humidity, with an attention that bordered on religious devotion. At night, she lay awake doing arithmetic, trying to account for every possible variable. How much would they need if the cold continued into May, as it sometimes did in the worst years? What if more food spoiled than expected, despite her careful management? What if someone fell ill and needed extra nutrition, consuming more than their standard ration? What if spring came late? If the ground stayed frozen into June? If they needed to stretch their supplies past all reasonable expectations? January and February passed in a kind of collective endurance, each day bleeding into the next, in a gray monotony, broken only by the weekly distribution of rations. The rations Praskovia distributed were adequate but spare, enough to maintain life and basic function, enough to prevent actual starvation, but not enough to feel truly satisfied, not enough to stop the constant low-level hunger that became everyone's companion. Hunger became a constant companion for everyone. Not the acute starvation that meant immediate danger, but the chronic low-level hunger that sapped energy and made every task feel heavier, that shortened tempers and lengthened nights. People moved more slowly, conserving energy, spending most of their time indoors, where warmth could be maintained more efficiently. There were complaints, inevitably, as the grumbling that comes when people are uncomfortable and see no immediate relief. Some families felt they weren't receiving their fair share, or that their contributions had been undervalued, that they deserved more based on their initial preparations or the size of their contribution to the communal stores. Some men resented being dependent on a system managed by women, felt it was unnatural or improper, that their survival depended on decisions made by someone's wife rather than by the settlement's male heads of household. Praskovia handled each complaint with patient firmness, showing her accounting, explaining her reasoning, refusing to be bullied or cajoled into changing allocations that she knew were correct. She kept meticulous records, writing down every distribution, every contribution, every adjustment, creating a paper trail that could be examined by anyone who doubted her fairness. In March, the worst month, when winter seemed like it would never end, and supplies had dwindled to levels that frightened everyone, when even Precia's careful optimism was tested by the reality of what remained, she made a discovery. In one of the cellars behind some empty sacks, she found a cache of potatoes that had been hidden away. Someone's private reserve held back from the communal stores in violation of the agreement everyone had made. The potatoes weren't many, perhaps enough to feed a family for 2 weeks, but they represented a betrayal of the collective trust that the system required. A private insurance policy purchased at the expense of community survival. She never revealed whose cash it was, understanding that public shaming would fracture the community in ways that might prove fatal. but she confiscated the potatoes and distributed them according to the same rationing system, adding them to the communal supply without comment. The incident reminded everyone that the system only worked if everyone participated honestly. And after that, no more hidden stores were discovered. Or at least, if they existed, no one was foolish enough to leave them where Precia might find them during her inspections. Spring, when it finally arrived in late April, felt like a resurrection, like the world remaking itself after a long death. The first bare patches of ground appearing through the snow, the first dripping of icicles from eaves, the first birds returning from the south. Each sign of winter's retreat was celebrated with quiet relief, with an easing of tension that had been held so long it had become almost unbearable. The settlement had survived, all of them, though everyone had lost weight, and some people, particularly the elderly, had become frighteningly thin, their faces drawn and their movements slow. But they were alive. And Precia's careful management of their collective resources had made the difference, had been the margin between survival and catastrophe. In the years that followed, the communal storage system became permanent, evolving and improving with experience as people adapted it to their specific needs and circumstances. Other settlements heard about it and adopted similar practices, sending representatives to learn from Paskovia, carrying her methods to communities scattered across hundreds of miles of Siberian wilderness. Praskovia's reputation spread beyond her immediate community, and occasionally people would travel considerable distances to consult with her about winter preparation and food storage, arriving with questions and leaving with knowledge that might save lives. She never sought recognition or praise for what she did, never advertised her expertise or claimed special status. To her, it was simply necessary, the application of observation and calculation to the problem of survival, the natural outcome of paying attention and thinking ahead. But those who knew her understood that her quiet management had saved lives, had preserved families, had given the settlement a resilience it wouldn't otherwise have possessed. As she aged, as the years accumulated, and her hair turned gray and then white, Precia began training others in her methods, particularly younger women who showed aptitude for the detailed observation and careful judgment that effective food management required. She understood that knowledge needed to be passed on, that systems needed to outlive the people who created them, that her death would eventually come, and the community needed to be prepared for that loss. She worked with 3 women in particular, teaching them not just the practical skills, but the underlying principles, the way of thinking that allowed prediction and planning. She taught them to see patterns, to extrapolate from small signs to large conclusions, to trust their instincts when those instincts were grounded in experience and observation. She died in 1854, in early spring, just as the ice on the river was beginning to break up, the sound of cracking ice echoing across the valley like distant thunder. She had descended into a cellar to check on some questionable potatoes, had felt a sudden pain in her chest, sharp and overwhelming, and had barely made it back up the stairs before collapsing, her body finally claiming the rest it had been denied for so long. Her daughter found her lying in the mud beside the cellar entrance, already gone, her face peaceful, in a way it rarely had been in life. They buried her as soon as the ground was soft enough to dig in the small cemetery, beside the chapel where others from the settlement rested. The priest spoke of her contributions to the community, her wisdom, her dedication, finding words to capture a life that had been lived largely without spectacle or drama, but with consistent purpose. But the real memorial to Precia wasn't the burial or the words spoken over her grave, wasn't the wooden marker her sons carved or the prayers Father Dmitri offered. It was the settlement itself, surviving year after year, through brutal winters, managing their collective resources with systems she had pioneered, adapting and improving on her foundation. It was the women she had trained, carrying on her work, teaching the next generation, and passing along not just techniques, but a whole philosophy of survival based on preparation, cooperation, and careful observation. It was the lives saved by careful preparation, the families that endured, because someone had understood the mathematics of survival and had cared enough to implement them, to fight for them even when resistance seemed overwhelming. In the settlement records, her death is noted in the same careful script that recorded her birth. Precia Yanovna died 1854, age 63, survived by 4 children and 11 grandchildren. But the records cannot capture what she truly was, a quiet architect of survival. A woman who understood that winter's greatest challenge wasn't the cold itself, but the human tendency to underestimate it, to hope rather than prepare, to individualize what needed to be collective. She had recognized that survival in such extreme conditions required both technical knowledge and social organization, that neither alone was sufficient. But together, they could create resilience that no individual family could achieve. Her grave weathered and settled, and eventually, the wooden marker rotted away, replaced once and then allowed to disappear entirely as newer graves claimed attention and memory. But long after her name faded from memory, long after no one remained who had known her personally, the system she created continued to function, adapted and improved by generations who never knew her name but benefited from her wisdom. The settlement grew over the decades, adding families and expanding its territory, eventually becoming substantial enough to be noted on maps, to receive regular visits from government officials, to participate in the larger economic networks that connected Siberia to Russia proper. But through all that growth and change, the communal storage system remained modified and modernized, but fundamentally recognizable as Praskovia's creation, a testament to the enduring value of her insights. And sometimes in late autumn, when the first serious snows began to fall, when women descended into cellars to check their winter stores, they moved with a particular attention to detail, a careful thoroughness that they might not have been able to explain, but that came from knowledge passed down across generations, knowledge that had originated in one woman's determination that her community would not starve, that winter would not claim those she could save through foresight and careful planning, and an unwavering commitment to collective survival. Deep in the Siberian taiga, where settlements have long since been abandoned, and the forest has reclaimed what humans once carved from wilderness, archaeologists occasionally stumble upon structures that defy easy explanation. These are the cold wells, cylindrical shafts, descending 15, sometimes 20 ft into earth that remains frozen year-round, their walls lined with logs arranged in patterns that suggest both engineering sophistication and ritual significance. The first documented discovery occurred in 1923 when a Soviet geological survey team working near the Lena River, found what they initially assumed was an old mine shaft. But there was no evidence of mineral extraction, no tailings, no worked stone. Instead, the shaft was perfectly cylindrical, its walls lined with birch logs, fitted so precisely that even after perhaps a century, water had never penetrated the joints. The team leader, a geologist named Mikhail Sakulov, noted in his field journal that the precision of the joinery reminded him of fine furniture construction, not the rough work one would expect from frontier settlers struggling to survive. At the bottom of that first discovered well, archaeologists found a layer of what appeared to be deliberately placed permafrost soil that had been excavated from deeper frozen layers and brought up to line the floor. Mixed with this frozen soil were fragments of bone, scraps of birch bark, and what might have been animal hide, all preserved in the perpetual cold, like artifacts sealed in ice. The discovery sparked interest, but no immediate answers. The well was documented, measured, photographed, and then largely forgotten as political upheavals consumed the Soviet Union's attention. It would be decades before anyone returned to the site with serious archaeological intent. During those intervening years, the forest continued its patient work of reclamation, and the well's opening became partially obscured by moss and fallen branches, nature slowly erasing the evidence of human intervention. In the 1970s, a team from Kutsk University began systematically searching for similar structures across eastern Siberia. They found 17 more cold wells within a relatively confined geographic area, all sharing certain characteristics, but each unique in subtle ways. The wells ranged in depth from 12 to 22 ft, with diameters between 4 and 6 ft, large enough for a person to descend, small enough that the excavation would have required tremendous labor. One researcher calculated that excavating a single well through frozen ground using the tools available in the 18th or 19th century would have required hundreds of hours of work, possibly thousands if the ground was particularly hard. What struck the researchers most was the sophistication of the construction. These weren't simple holes dug into frozen ground. The log linings showed evidence of careful selection, birch primarily, but also large in some cases, both woods known for their resistance to rot. The logs had been stripped of bark, shaped to fit precisely, and arranged in a spiral pattern that seemed designed to prevent any shift or collapse as the ground froze and thawed with the seasons. Some wells showed evidence of a wooden platform or grating at the top, long since rotted away, but leaving marks where support beams had been anchored into the surrounding ground. This suggested the wells had been covered, protected from rain and snow, accessible only by removing the cover, a design that would have helped maintain stable temperatures within. But the greatest mystery lay in what the wells contained, or rather, what they once contained. Excavations revealed layers of organic material that told partial stories, fish bones concentrated in certain strata, suggesting mass storage of preserved fish, fragments of what might have been wooden containers, their shapes barely discernible after decades or centuries of decay. Seeds from berries that grew in the region, sometimes in quantities that suggested they'd been stored in large amounts. One well discovered near the Kolmar River in 1982 yielded something particularly intriguing. A layer of animal fat that had somehow remained preserved in the permafrost at the bottom of the shaft. Chemical analysis suggested it was reindeer fat, and the quantity extrapolated from the layer's extent would have represented dozens of animals' worth of rendered fat, an enormous concentration of calories and nutrition. The question that haunted researchers was simple. Why? Why dig these elaborate wells when conventional root cellars, the kind used by Siberian settlers for centuries, were easier to construct and served similar purposes? The labor involved in excavating 20 ft into frozen ground, in lining the shaft with precisely fitted logs, in maintaining these structures over time. It all suggested the well served a purpose beyond simple food storage. A standard root cellar dug only 6 or 70 ft deep and lined with rough logs or stones could preserve root vegetables and some preserved foods through a Siberian winter with a fraction of the effort. Some researchers proposed they were emergency caches created during times of plenty to serve as insurance against catastrophic winters. The depth and careful construction would have kept food frozen even during brief summer thaws, essentially creating natural deep freezes that could preserve food for years rather than months. Others suggested a communal purpose, that these wells belonged not to individual families, but to entire settlements or even regional groups. The sheer quantity of food that could be stored in a properly maintained cold well, thousands of pounds of frozen fish, meat, fat, and berries, exceeded what a single family would need and implied some form of collective management. There were cultural interpretations as well, drawn from fragmentary records of indigenous Siberian practices and from folklore that had survived among the descendants of early Russian settlers. Some traditions spoke of winter guardians, places where food was stored not just for immediate survival, but as offerings to ensure future abundance, as insurance against the caprice of nature. One particularly intriguing account came from an elderly woman interviewed in 1989, whose grandmother had been born in the 1850s in a settlement near the Vitim River. According to family stories passed down through generations, her grandmother had spoken of a deep, cold place where the community stored food that could only be accessed in times of true emergency, and then only with the agreement of the settlement's elders. The grandmother's stories described ceremonies held in autumn when the harvest had been completed and winter preparations made. Representatives from each family would contribute a portion of their stores to the deep, cold place, always the best of what they had, not the damaged or questionable food. This contribution was seen as insurance, but also as an obligation, a way of binding the community together through shared risk and shared provision. The ritual aspect was emphasized in the account. The opening of the well was accompanied by prayers or invocations. The placing of food was done with care and respect, and the sealing of the well marked the community's readiness for winter. According to the account, the deep, cold place was opened only twice in the grandmother's lifetime. Once during a winter of catastrophic crop failure, and once during a spring when unexpected late freezes killed most of the settlement's livestock. Each time, the stored food had been distributed according to need, managed by women who understood preservation and rationing, and the community had survived what might otherwise have been fatal disasters. The account was tantalizing but difficult to verify. The settlement the grandmother had lived in no longer existed, swallowed by the forest decades ago. Archaeological surveys of the area had foundations, remnants of structures, but no cold well, though that didn't necessarily mean one hadn't existed. The forest keeps its secrets well, and decades of growth can obscure even substantial structures. The researcher who conducted the interview tried to map the location based on the elderly woman's descriptions, but memory and time had blurred the landmarks, and what might once have been clear reference points had been altered by logging, fire, and natural succession. What archaeologists did find in multiple cold wells across Siberia were markings that suggested ritualistic or symbolic significance. Some wells had logs carved with simple geometric patterns, lines, circles, occasionally what might have been stylized representations of animals or plants. These carvings were weathered and difficult to interpret, but their presence suggested the wells were more than purely utilitarian structures. The patterns varied from well to well with no obvious standardization, suggesting either regional variations in practice or individual expressions by the builders. One researcher, examining a particularly well-preserved well near Yakutsk, noted that the spiral pattern of the log lining created an optical effect when looking down from above. The logs seemed to descend endlessly, creating a sense of depth beyond the actual physical depth of the shaft. Whether this was intentional, a deliberate design choice meant to inspire, or to symbolically connect the storage space with deeper earth, remained a matter of speculation. The construction methods themselves raised questions about the knowledge systems possessed by Siberian peoples, both indigenous and settler. Building a structure that could maintain stable temperatures, prevent water infiltration, resist the tremendous forces generated by freezing and thawing ground, and last for decades or even centuries required sophisticated understanding of materials, thermodynamics, and structural engineering. This knowledge wasn't written down, wasn't preserved in technical manuals or architectural plans. It existed in practice, in the accumulated wisdom of people who understood their environment through generations of intimate observation. The cold wells represented a kind of vernacular genius, solutions to problems of survival that emerged from direct engagement with the specific challenges of Siberian winters. Consider the problem of joint construction. Each log had to fit precisely against its neighbors, while allowing for the expansion and contraction that occurred as temperatures fluctuated across seasons. Modern attempts to replicate cold well construction, undertaken by experimental archaeologists, revealed just how sophisticated the original builders had been. Initial attempts failed. Wells flooded, walls collapsed, temperatures proved unstable. It took multiple iterations, careful attention to details like log selection and joint construction, to create wells that functioned even remotely, as well as the ancient examples. One team spent 3 summers attempting to build a functional cold well, using period-appropriate tools and techniques. And while they eventually succeeded in creating a structure that remained frozen through summer, they acknowledged that their well lacked the elegance and efficiency of the originals. The mystery deepened with the discovery that not all cold wells were the same age. Carbon dating of organic materials found in various wells suggested construction spanning at least 2 centuries, possibly more. Some wells appeared to date from the 18th century, others from the 19th, and a few might have been even older, though dating becomes less precise beyond certain time periods. The oldest reliably dated well, near the Vitim River, showed construction techniques that suggested building around 1740. Though the margin of error on such dates remains substantial, this raised the possibility that cold well construction was a tradition that persisted over time, knowledge passed down through generations and adapted to local conditions. Some settlements had cold wells, others didn't. Some regions showed concentrations of wells, while vast areas showed none at all. The distribution pattern suggested the practice emerged in specific locations and spread along certain routes, perhaps following migration paths or trade networks. There were hints, frustratingly incomplete, that cold wells might have been connected to indigenous knowledge systems that predated Russian settlement. Some of the oldest wells showed construction techniques that differed slightly from those used in later examples. Different wood selections, different joint patterns, different approaches to managing the interface between frozen and unfrozen ground. Indigenous peoples of Siberia had lived in these landscapes for thousands of years before Russian settlers arrived. They had developed their own sophisticated methods for food preservation and storage adapted to local conditions and available materials. It wasn't unreasonable to suggest that settlers had learned from indigenous practices, had adopted and adapted techniques that already existed. Historical records from early Russian explorers and settlers occasionally mentioned learning survival techniques from native peoples, though these accounts were often vague and filtered through cultural biases that made it difficult to extract precise technical information. But the evidence was circumstantial, and the indigenous peoples who might have confirmed or explained these connections had largely been displaced or assimilated by the time archaeologists began asking questions. Oral traditions had been disrupted, knowledge systems fragmented. What remained were structures in the ground and fragmentary stories that didn't quite connect into a coherent narrative. Researchers attempted to work with Ieni, Saka, and other indigenous groups to gather information about traditional storage practices. But by the late 20th century, most communities had been using modern refrigeration for generations, and knowledge of older techniques had faded. One particularly intriguing cold, well discovered in 1995 near the Alden River, contained something unexpected: a wooden box, small and carefully constructed, buried in the frozen soil at the very bottom of the shaft. The box had been sealed with resin, and inside, preserved by the perpetual cold, were seeds. Dozens of different varieties of seeds, carefully separated and wrapped in pieces of birch bark. The seeds were identified as vegetables and grains that had been cultivated in Siberia: turnips, cabbage, peas, barley, rye. But some were varieties that no longer existed in cultivation, genetic lineages that had been lost to time and changing agricultural practices. The discovery suggested the cold well had served in part as a seed bank, a way of preserving genetic diversity against crop failures or other catastrophes. Agricultural historians who examined the seeds noted that some varieties showed adaptations to extremely short growing seasons and cold temperatures, traits that had been bred out of modern cultivars in favor of higher yields under more controlled conditions. This finding shifted some researchers' thinking about the well's purpose. Perhaps they weren't primarily about food storage at all, or at least not only about immediate survival. Perhaps they represented a longer-term strategy, a way of ensuring that even if a settlement was destroyed or abandoned, knowledge and resources would persist, frozen in the ground, waiting to be recovered. The seed cache suggested a level of planning that looked beyond immediate winters to consider multi-generational survival strategies. The idea resonated with patterns observed in other circumpolar cultures, where harsh environments had led to elaborate strategies for preserving knowledge and resources across generations. The cold wells might have been Siberia's equivalent. Archives embedded in permafrost, insurance against the ultimate catastrophes that periodically swept through human communities in these marginal lands. But like so much about the cold wells, this interpretation remained speculative. The wells kept their secrets well, yielding just enough information to suggest fascinating possibilities while refusing to provide definitive answers. Each new discovery added pieces to the puzzle, but never quite completed the picture. Researchers developed theories, tested hypotheses against the physical evidence, and found that the wells supported multiple interpretations without decisively confirming any single one. Modern climate change has added urgency to the study of cold wells. As permafrost thaws across Siberia, structures that have remained frozen and stable for centuries are beginning to deteriorate. Wells that survived intact for generations are now collapsing as the ground around them loses its frozen solidity. Organic materials that were preserved in permafrost are beginning to decay, their information content being lost to time. Archaeologists race to document cold wells before they're lost, but resources are limited and Siberia is vast. For every well that gets properly excavated and studied, dozens or hundreds remain undiscovered, slowly collapsing back into the earth that once preserved them. The knowledge they contain about construction techniques, about food preservation strategies, about how people survived in one of Earth's harshest environments is disappearing. Funding for such research is difficult to secure, and the logistical challenges of working in remote Siberian locations make comprehensive surveys nearly impossible. Sometimes, walking in the taiga, far from any settlement, you might notice a slight depression in the ground, a circular area where trees grow a little differently, where the vegetation shows a pattern that doesn't quite match its surroundings. These subtle signs might mark the location of a cold well, its wooden lining long since rotted away, its carefully stored contents consumed or decayed, but its presence still marked in the landscape for those who know how to read such signs. The indigenous peoples who still live in these regions, the descendants of both native Siberians and Russian settlers, sometimes speak of knowing where the old storage places were. But when pressed for details, for exact locations or specific knowledge, the information tends to dissolve into vagueness. Perhaps the knowledge has genuinely been lost. Perhaps it's being protected, kept within communities, not shared with outsiders and archaeologists. There's something fitting in this. The idea that some knowledge remains beyond recovery, that some mysteries persist, not because they're impossible to solve, but because the people who held the answers chose not to share them, or because the systems of knowledge transmission were disrupted before full transfer could occur. The cold wells become, in this light, monuments to the fragility of cultural knowledge, to how easily sophisticated understanding can slip away when the contexts that sustained it are disrupted. The cold wells remain then as partial riddles. We know they existed. We know roughly how they were built. We can make educated guesses about what they contained and how they were used. But the full story, the cultural meanings, the social organizations that maintained them, the specific practices that surrounded their use, remains partially hidden, frozen in the past as surely as food was once frozen in their depths. Each well excavated adds fragments of information, but the complete picture continues to elude researchers. Perhaps that's appropriate for structures designed to preserve things across time. They've preserved themselves, after all, not completely, but sufficiently to remind us that human ingenuity takes many forms, that solutions to fundamental problems, like winter survival, emerged in ways we're still trying to fully understand. That the people who lived in these harsh landscapes possessed knowledge that we've only begun to appreciate. The technical sophistication of the wells becomes more apparent the more closely one examines them. Consider the problem of thermal management. Maintaining consistent freezing temperatures through summer required understanding how cold penetrates and persists in soil, how different materials conduct or insulate, how air circulation affects temperature stability. The builders knew, somehow, that deeper was better, that certain depths remained frozen regardless of surface conditions. They knew which woods resisted rot in perpetually damp conditions, which joint patterns would flex without failing as ground shifted, which orientations and locations offered natural advantages for maintaining cold. Some wells were positioned near streams or rivers, others on slight elevations, still others in dense forest where shade kept ground temperatures lower. The positioning wasn't random. Each location showed evidence of deliberate selection based on criteria that made sense for the well's intended function. Researchers mapping well locations noticed patterns that suggested knowledge of local microclimates, understanding of how landscape features affected ground temperature and moisture. This was sophisticated environmental knowledge, the kind that emerges only from sustained observation and experimentation. There are accounts, fragmentary and difficult to verify, of wells being checked regularly through winter and spring, of people descending into the shafts to assess conditions and retrieve small amounts of stored food. One story recorded in the early 20th century from an elderly man in a settlement near Kutsk described his grandfather's practice of lowering a candle into the well before descending. If the candle went out, the air at the bottom might be bad, and he would wait before entering. This suggested awareness of gas accumulation in enclosed spaces, another piece of practical knowledge that speaks to sophisticated understanding. Organic materials decomposing, even at cold temperatures, can produce gases that displace oxygen, creating hazardous conditions in confined spaces. The candle served as both thermometer and atmosphere tester, its flame indicating temperature and oxygen availability. Such practices weren't unique to Siberia. Miners and well diggers worldwide used similar techniques, but their application to cold well management shows integration of diverse knowledge into coherent practice. The social dimensions of cold well use remain largely obscure but endlessly fascinating. If wells were indeed communal resources, how were access rights determined and enforced? Who decided when emergency conditions justified opening the well? How were contributions tracked and withdrawals monitored? Some researchers suggest the wells functioned within gift economy frameworks common to many northern cultures, where contribution and reciprocity operated through social obligation rather than formal accounting. Others propose more structured systems, perhaps with designated keepers responsible for well maintenance and access control. A few wells showed evidence of locks or securing mechanisms at the top, suggesting concern about unauthorized access. One well near Yakut had metal fittings that appeared to have held a substantial lock, though the lock itself had long since disappeared. This implied resources valuable enough to protect, trust insufficient, to rely purely on social norms, or both. The presence of security measures at some wells, but not others, might reflect differences in social organization, resource scarcity, or historical period. The question of how long food remained viable in cold wells has practical importance for understanding their function. Modern food science suggests that properly frozen food can remain nutritious for years, though quality gradually degrades. But the wells weren't modern freezers with controlled temperatures and sealed containers. They were complex natural systems where temperature fluctuated seasonally, where moisture levels varied, where the food itself existed in direct contact with soil and other organic materials. Experimental work suggested that fish and meat, if frozen quickly and stored at consistent temperatures below freezing, could remain edible for several years. Seeds, particularly if kept dry and very cold, could remain viable for decades. Fats and oils were more problematic. They could go rancid even when frozen if exposed to air or fluctuating temperatures. Yet the reindeer fat found in the Colmer well appeared to have been preserved for a substantial period, suggesting storage techniques that minimize degradation. Perhaps the fat had been sealed in containers, or perhaps the permafrost environment provided preservation beyond what controlled experiments could replicate. The chemical analysis that identified the fat as coming from reindeer also detected compounds that might have been preservatives: birch tar or spruce resin, substances known to have antimicrobial properties. This raised the possibility that stored foods were treated before being placed in wells, that preservation was a multi-stage process, combining chemical treatment, proper packaging, and optimal storage conditions. If so, the knowledge required extended beyond well construction to include understanding of natural preservatives, optimal treatment methods, and proper handling of foods intended for long-term storage. The seed cache found near the Alden River suggested another dimension of preservation knowledge. Seeds require specific conditions to remain viable: appropriate moisture content, stable temperatures, protection from pests and fungi. The careful separation and wrapping of different seed varieties in birch bark showed understanding that different seeds had different requirements, that mixing them could lead to moisture transfer or cross-contamination. The birch bark itself was an interesting choice. It has natural antifungal properties and provides a degree of moisture regulation while allowing some air circulation. Botanical analysis of the seeds revealed something unexpected. Some showed evidence of being from particularly vigorous or productive plants. They weren't random samples, but selected seeds from plants that had demonstrated desirable traits. This implied active plant breeding, selection for characteristics suited to Siberian growing conditions, early maturation, cold tolerance, drought resistance. The cold wells served not just to preserve generic seeds, but to protect carefully selected genetic lines, to maintain agricultural knowledge embodied in plant varieties, developed through generations of selection and cultivation. The loss of these varieties represents more than just lost diversity. It's lost adaptation, lost solutions to the specific challenges of growing food in marginal environments. Modern agriculture, with its focus on industrial-scale production and standardized varieties, has little use for plants adapted to the short cold growing seasons and poor soils of eastern Siberia. Yet, as climate shifts and agricultural zones change, the traits bred into those lost varieties might prove valuable. The cold wells preserved them for generations, but the warming that now threatens the wells themselves came too late for most of that botanical heritage to be recovered. Some researchers have begun exploring whether cold well principles might be applied to modern challenges. Could structures based on cold well design provide low-energy food storage in permafrost regions? Might the construction techniques inform approaches to building in areas where ground instability from thawing permafrost threatens modern infrastructure? These questions have generated interest, but little practical application so far, partly because the specific knowledge that made cold wells work remains incompletely understood. One experimental project in Yakutia attempted to build a modern version of a cold well using traditional design principles but contemporary materials and tools. The structure functioned reasonably well, maintaining freezing temperatures through summer and serving as storage for a research station's food supplies. But the builders acknowledged that their well lacked something the originals possessed, a quality they struggled to define, but recognized as absent. Perhaps it was the integration of design with landscape, the way traditional wells seem to emerge from their environment rather than being imposed upon it. Perhaps it was simply time, the refinement that comes from generations of use and modification. Whatever the missing element, its absence highlighted how much had been lost, how difficult reconstructing traditional knowledge proves, even when physical examples exist to study. The cold wells also raise questions about how we understand and value different forms of knowledge. Academic archaeology and anthropology prioritize certain types of evidence: measurable, documentable, replicable. But much of what made cold wells successful existed in practiced technique, in knowing through doing, in wisdom that never became explicit enough to record, even if systems of recording had existed. This embodied knowledge leaves few traces in the archaeological record. Yet, it was likely as important as the physical structures themselves. An experienced builder would have known things impossible to capture in drawings or measurements: how wood sounds when properly fitted, how frozen ground feels when it's ready to accept a log, how air smells at the bottom of a shaft when conditions are right. These sensory guides to practice disappear when practice ceases, and no amount of careful excavation can recover them. They must be relearned through experience, through making mistakes and adjusting technique, through developing the sensitivity that comes only from repeated engagement with materials and environment. The experimental archaeologists who attempted to replicate cold wells discovered this. They could measure dimensions and analyze joints, but learning to build required doing, failing, and trying again until hands and eyes and intuition aligned. The cold wells thus become reminders of the limitations of purely analytical approaches to understanding past practices. We can document what remains, we can analyze and measure and date, but we cannot fully know what it meant to build and maintain these structures, to be part of communities that relied on them, to possess the embodied knowledge that made them work. This doesn't mean we shouldn't try to understand. The effort yields valuable insights, even when complete understanding remains elusive. But it suggests humility about the limits of what archaeology and historical research can recover. about the silences in the record that no amount of careful study can fully overcome. In recent years, some Siberian communities have expressed interest in cold wells as part of cultural heritage, as connection to historical practices and identities. This interest sometimes conflicts with archaeological priorities. Communities may want to use or modify wells in ways that compromise research value, while researchers want to preserve wells as scientific resources. Negotiating these different values and interests requires recognizing that cold wells mean different things to different people, that their significance isn't purely historical or scientific, but also cultural and identity-based. For descendants of the people who built and used cold wells, they represent continuity with ancestors, tangible links to ways of life that might otherwise seem entirely lost. For indigenous communities in particular, cold wells can be powerful symbols of sophisticated pre-con knowledge, evidence that ancestors possessed technical skills and environmental understanding worthy of respect. This symbolic value exists independent of whether specific communities actually built or used cold wells. The structures stand as representatives of broader northern indigenous knowledge and adaptation. Some communities have begun incorporating cold wells into cultural education programs, teaching young people about traditional practices as part of maintaining cultural identity. These programs face challenges. Most communities no longer have functioning wells to learn from, and replicating authentic construction requires skills and knowledge that few people still possess. But the effort itself has value, creating opportunities for elders to share what they remember or have been told, for communities to engage with their histories in tangible ways, for younger generations to develop appreciation for ancestors' ingenuity. Whether these programs successfully transmit technical knowledge matters less than their role in maintaining cultural continuity and pride. The cold wells, in the end, offer no simple lessons or clear conclusions. They resist easy interpretation, their complexity reflecting the complexity of the people and societies that created them. They remind us that human adaptation to challenging environments takes innumerable forms, that survival strategies emerge from specific contexts and cannot be generalized or transplanted without losing essential character. They demonstrate that people living close to the edge of environmental possibility develop sophisticated knowledge that deserves recognition and study, even when that knowledge comes to us fragmentary, airy, and incomplete. They also remind us of what we lose when connections between people and land are broken, when knowledge systems are disrupted, when practices cease and understanding fades. The cold wells survived for generations because knowledge and practice passed from builders to users to new builders in continuous chains of learning and teaching. When those chains broke, the wells remained, but their meanings changed from lived reality to archaeological puzzle, from practical infrastructure to mysterious artifact. The wells themselves haven't changed, but our relationship to them has, marked by distance and loss that no amount of study can entirely bridge. Yet something persists beyond the loss. The structures themselves, testimony to what was possible, to what people achieved in demanding circumstances. Walking in the Tiger, coming upon one of those subtle depressions that marks where a well once was, there's a moment of connection across time. Someone stood here generations ago, looked at this landscape, and decided this was the right spot. Someone dug into frozen ground, shaped logs to fit, built something meant to last and to serve. The people are gone. Much of what they knew is gone, but the place remembers. The forest grows a little different here. The ground settles in particular ways. And for those who know how to see it, the well remains visible in the landscape it served. While frontier families counted potatoes and rationed flour, another world existed in parallel. A world of stone-walled stores and servants assigned to monitor preserves of imported luxuries and winter feasts that seemed to mock the scarcity endured by those who actually worked the land. The divide between peasant and noble in Siberia was as stark as the division between winter and summer, and nowhere was this more evident than in how each class approached the fundamental challenge of surviving the cold months. In the larger settlements and administrative centers scattered across Siberia, places like Kutsk, Tobolsk, and Yakutsk, government officials and wealthy merchants occupied a different reality entirely. Their homes, built of stone or thick timber, with proper foundations and multiple rooms, included dedicated storage spaces designed by architects rather than improvised by desperate farmers. These cellars were engineering achievements with stone walls, proper ventilation systems, and drainage that prevented the flooding that plagued peasant storage pits. The cellar of a wealthy merchant's home in Irkutsk might extend beneath the entire house, divided into separate chambers for different types of storage. One room for root vegetables, kept at precise temperatures through careful management of airflow. Another for preserved meats, cool but not freezing, with hooks suspended from ceiling beams where hams and sausages hung like strange fruit. A third room, the coldest, essentially a natural refrigerator, where the permafrost beneath provided constant freezing temperatures year-round. Servants, usually serfs, bound to the household, maintained these cellars with the kind of attention that peasants reserved for their entire year's food supply. Temperature had to be monitored not through touch and instinct, as peasants did, but with actual thermometers imported from European Russia. Humidity levels required management achieved through trays of sand that could be moistened or dried as needed. Any sign of spoilage demanded immediate attention, the affected items removed before contamination could spread. The quantity of food stored in elite households defied the arithmetic of mere survival. Where a peasant family might store $200 of potatoes and consider themselves adequately supplied, a merchant household would store $2,000, 10 times as much, for perhaps twice as many people. But this wasn't just about feeding the household. It was about maintaining status, about being able to host dinners and entertain guests, about demonstrating prosperity through abundance. Winter entertaining among Siberia's elite followed rituals imported from European Russia and adapted to local conditions. When guests arrived at a merchant's home in January, they would be greeted with warmth that seemed miraculous. Multiple stoves burning continuously, rooms heated to temperatures that felt tropical compared to the bitter cold outside. The contrast itself was a form of display, a demonstration that the host commanded resources sufficient to hold winter at bay. The meals served at such gatherings bore little resemblance to what peasants ate. Yes, there were the same basic ingredients: potatoes, cabbage, beets, but prepared with imported spices, with butter and cream, with attention to presentation that elevated food into something approaching art. Preserved fish appeared not as emergency rations, but as delicacies. sturgeon from the river served with lemon, imported at great expense from the south, or smoked olmal arranged artfully on porcelain plates. Meat featured prominently in elite winter diets in ways impossible for peasants. While a frontier family might have a few pounds of smoked elk to stretch across months, a wealthy household would have entire rooms dedicated to meat storage. Beef, pork, venison, bear, fowl of various kinds, all preserved through smoking, salting, or simply kept frozen in the coldest storage chambers. A single dinner party might consume more meat than a peasant family saw in an entire winter. But perhaps the most striking difference lay in the luxuries that had nothing to do with basic nutrition. Sugar imported from the distant south at prices that would have bankrupted a peasant household appeared in desserts and sweetened tea. Tea itself, real Chinese tea, not the herbal substitutes peasants brewed, was consumed daily, multiple times daily, in quantities that suggested bottomless supply. Dried fruits from warmer climates, apricots, figs, raisins, provided flavors and textures completely unavailable to those living on the frontier. Vodka, that quintessential Russian spirit, existed in fundamentally different forms depending on class. Peasants drank rough spirits distilled from whatever grain they could spare, alcohol that burned going down and left heads aching the next morning. Elite households served vodka, flavored with berries, with honey, with herbs and spices, stored in glass bottles rather than clay jugs, presented in small crystal glasses rather than wooden cups. The social rituals surrounding food storage and distribution differed as completely as the quantities involved. Where peasant communities might gather to discuss communal storage strategies, elite households operated through hierarchies of servants and detailed record-keeping. Stewards maintained written inventories of everything stored, noting dates of preservation, locations within the cellars, expected shelf life. These records were reviewed regularly. Decisions about use and distribution made according to systems that prized order and documentation. Some elite households employed specialists, people whose entire job was managing food preservation and storage. These weren't the women of the household working alongside their daughters, as in peasant families, but paid professionals, often men who had learned their craft through apprenticeship and who took pride in their expertise. They knew the optimal temperature for storing caviar, the precise salt concentration needed for different types of fish, the proper aging time for various preserved meats. The government maintained its own storage systems, warehouses and granaries that operated on an entirely different scale than household cellars. In larger towns, wooden structures the size of small churches held grain reserves meant to prevent famine during crop failures. These state granaries were guarded by soldiers, their contents recorded in ledgers maintained by bureaucrats, their distribution governed by regulations handed down from distant St. Petersburg. The existence of these state reserves created a complex relationship between government and populace. In theory, the reserves existed to protect everyone, to ensure that even catastrophic crop failures wouldn't result in mass starvation. In practice, access to state supplies was mediated by officials who might be corrupt, who might prioritize certain groups over others, who might delay distribution until desperation became dire. Peasants knew these warehouses existed, knew that somewhere in the regional capital, grain sat in abundance while they rationed their last sacks of flour. The knowledge created resentment. but also a kind of bitter acceptance. The world was divided between those who controlled resources and those who scraped by. And winter simply made this division more visible, more impossible to ignore. Government officials posted to Siberia, administrators, military officers, judges, received allowances meant to compensate for the hardships of frontier service. These allowances included food rations, far exceeding what they could actually consume, the excess providing opportunities for profitable trade or simply for wasteful abundance. An official might receive monthly allocations of grain, meat, butter, and tea sufficient for a household of 10 or 12, even when he lived alone or with just a wife. Some officials used this excess generously, distributing surplus to those in need, hosting meals for subordinates and visitors, essentially functioning as informal sources of welfare for the communities they administered. Others hoarded, sold their allocations at inflated prices, or simply let food rot rather than share it with those they considered beneath their station. The quality of winter survival in some communities depended significantly on the character of the officials stationed there. The tension between classes rarely erupted into open conflict. Siberia's harsh environment created a certain shared understanding that survival required at least minimal cooperation. But the tension existed nonetheless, visible in the careful way peasants addressed their social superiors, in the rumors that circulated about official corruption, in the quiet satisfaction peasants felt when an elite household suffered some setback or loss. There were instances documented in letters and diaries from the period of elite households facing genuine winter hardship despite their apparent advantages. A fire could destroy warehouses full of supplies just as easily as it could destroy a peasant's single cellar. Corruption or incompetence could mean that expected supply shipments never arrived, leaving even wealthy households scrambling. Disease could strike elite and peasant alike, and all the stored food in the world meant nothing if no one remained healthy enough to prepare and consume it. One particularly detailed account comes from the diary of Dmitry Nikolai Volkonsky, a minor noble assigned to administrative duties in Yakutsk in the 1830s. His writings reveal the peculiar anxiety of someone accustomed to comfort suddenly confronted with genuine scarcity. A shipping accident on the Lena River in autumn meant that expected supplies from the south never arrived. The city's merchants, anticipating shortages, immediately raised prices on existing stocks. Volkonsky found himself in the unusual position of having money but limited access to goods. His carefully maintained cellar, which at the beginning of winter had seemed adequately stocked, suddenly appeared inadequate when he couldn't replenish it as expected. His diary entries track his growing concern as months passed and supplies dwindled faster than anticipated. What makes his account particularly interesting is his awareness of the irony in his situation. He wrote explicitly about how, for perhaps the first time in his life, he understood the calculations that peasants made constantly. How many weeks until supplies ran out? Whether to eat normally now or ration immediately, what could be sacrificed or substituted. The experience humbled him, or at least made him more conscious of the fragility underlying even privileged existence in Siberia. His diary also reveals the social dynamics among the elite during scarcity. Households that had supplies guarded them carefully, declining to sell or trade at any price. Social gatherings became occasions for subtle competition. Who could still serve meat? who still had real tea, who could maintain the appearance of abundance despite the underlying shortage. Status and reputation became bound up with the ability to project plenty even as private stores depleted. Falkonsky's household survived the winter, though he noted that by March they were eating things he would have previously considered beneath his station. The experience changed him in ways he struggled to articulate, made him more sympathetic to the peasants he administered, more aware of how little separated comfort from desperation in Siberia's unforgiving climate. But such moments of cross-class understanding remained exceptional. Most of the time, the division persisted, reinforced by social structures, by legal restrictions, by the simple fact that wealth and position provided buffers against hardship that most people would never possess. The physical spaces where elite and peasant food storage occurred reflected these divisions perfectly. A noble's cellar was a constructed space planned and built with specific purposes in mind, maintained according to written protocols, accessed through proper doorways, with locks that controlled entry. A peasant's cellar was improvised, dug where circumstances permitted, maintained through inherited wisdom and desperate attention, accessible to whoever needed to check supplies regardless of hour or weather. Yet both depended ultimately on the same fundamental principle: that cold and darkness could preserve food, could slow decay, could stretch summer's abundance across winter's scarcity. The physics of preservation didn't care about class distinctions. A potato stored improperly would rot whether it belonged to a peasant or a prince. Meat inadequately cured would spoil regardless of who owned it. In this sense, winter was a great equalizer, even if its equality was never complete or perfect. Everyone faced the same basic challenge: store enough food, preserve it properly, make it last until spring. The resources available to meet this challenge varied enormously, but the challenge itself remained constant. Some elite households, particularly those that had been in Siberia for generations, developed a kind of practical wisdom that transcended class pretensions. They hired peasant women who understood preservation, listened to their advice, adapted traditional methods rather than assuming imported European techniques were superior. These households tended to fare better during difficult winters, their stored food lasting longer and deteriorating less than households that insisted on doing things according to manuals written for different climates. There were also instances of genuine cooperation during extreme emergencies. When winters proved catastrophically difficult, when crop failures or other disasters threatened entire regions, class boundaries could become somewhat permeable. Elite households might provide seed grain to peasants in spring, understanding that everyone's survival depended on successful planting. State granaries might distribute reserves more broadly than usual, bureaucrats temporarily prioritizing human survival over proper procedures. But these moments of cooperation, while real, shouldn't be romanticized. They occurred within a system that fundamentally privileged some lives over others, that allocated resources according to hierarchies that had nothing to do with need or merit. A peasant family might receive emergency grain from state reserves and survive the winter, but they would emerge from that winter still bound by the same social and economic structures that had made them vulnerable in the first place. The children of elite households grew up in a different relationship to winter than peasant children. They learned that cold was something to be kept outside beyond the walls, defeated by wealth and preparation. They learned that food was something that appeared at regular intervals, prepared by servants, abundant and varied. They might intellectually understand that winter was harsh, but they rarely experienced that harshness directly. Peasant children learned winter as an intimate enemy. They learned hunger not as a theoretical concept, but as a physical presence, a hollowness that accompanied them through late winter months. They learned that survival required constant vigilance, that small mistakes or bad luck could prove fatal. They learned to be grateful for bare sufficiency because they knew how quickly sufficiency could slip into scarcity. These different educations created different adults with different understandings of risk, security, and what constituted necessary preparation. An elite official might consider a household adequately supplied when it had 3 months of provisions, comfortable in the knowledge that supply lines existed and markets could provide more. A peasant would never feel truly secure, even with 6 months of supplies, knowing from experience how quickly situations could deteriorate. The documentary record from Siberia in the 18th and 19th centuries reflects these class divisions in its very existence and gaps. We have detailed records of elite households, their inventories, their expenditures, their social events, because these households generated written documents and because those documents were preserved. Peasant existence, by contrast, appears mostly in the records of others, in tax registers, in administrative reports, in church records of births and deaths. When peasants appear in elite writings, they're often rendered as types rather than individuals. The peasants suffered greatly that winter, rather than specific names and stories. This erasure wasn't necessarily malicious, but it reflected a worldview in which peasant lives simply mattered less, were less worthy of detailed recording, were more interchangeable and anonymous. Yet occasionally, in unexpected places, individual peasant voices emerge. A petition to an official preserved because it required a response, a testimony given in a legal proceeding, a letter written by a barely literate peasant to a relative in another settlement. These fragments remind us that behind the anonymous masses were specific people with names and personalities and stories that mostly vanished unrecorded. The contrast between elite comfort and peasant hardship during winter created a moral tension that some people felt acutely. Religious leaders, particularly Orthodox priests, serving in Siberian parishes, sometimes wrote about the contradiction between Christian teachings about charity and the reality of how resources were distributed. Some advocated for greater sharing, for systems that would distribute winter supplies more equitably. But institutional change came slowly, if at all. The structures that created and maintained class divisions were deeply entrenched, supported by law and custom, and the economic interests of those who benefited from them. A sympathetic priest might distribute what resources he controlled generously, might advocate for the poor in his sermons and writings. But he couldn't fundamentally alter systems that operated at scales far beyond parish boundaries. As Siberia gradually became more settled and integrated into the Russian Empire during the 19th century, some of these patterns began to shift. Market economies developed more fully. Transportation improved. The region became less isolated from the rest of Russia. These changes affected winter survival strategies in complex ways. On one hand, improved transportation meant supplies could be brought in more reliably, reducing the absolute dependence on local storage. Towns developed merchants who specialized in food trade, creating systems that could buffer individual household failures. On the other hand, market integration meant that scarcity in one region could ripple outward, affecting prices and availability across larger areas. The elite, with their greater access to money and credit, benefited disproportionately from these developments. They could order supplies from distant locations, could pay premium prices to secure goods even during shortages. Peasants, operating with minimal cash and no credit, remained dependent on what they could grow, gather, and preserve themselves. Yet, even as economic patterns shifted, the basic reality of Siberian winter remained unchanged. Whether you were wealthy or poor, noble or peasant, winter meant cold, darkness, and the absolute necessity of having food stored and preserved. The question wasn't whether you needed to prepare, but rather how much margin for error your resources provided. In the grand estates that some wealthy families maintained in Siberia, compounds that included not just houses, but workshops, stables, storage buildings, chapels, winter preparations involved coordinating dozens or even hundreds of people. Stewards drew up detailed plans, assigning tasks to servants and serfs, scheduling work to ensure everything was completed before the first serious snows. These preparations had the character of military campaigns, with similar attention to logistics and coordination. By contrast, a peasant family's preparations involved just the family members themselves, perhaps with some cooperation from immediate neighbors. The scale was completely different, but the consequences of failure were actually more dire for peasants. Where a wealthy household could survive losses by purchasing replacements, peasants had no such options. Some elite households, particularly those of administrators and military officers who were posted to Siberia for limited terms, approached winter with a kind of fatalism mixed with resentment. They saw their time in Siberia as an exile or punishment, endured rather than embraced. Their winter preparations were pre-unctor, just adequate enough to survive, until they could return to more temperate and civilized regions. Others, particularly merchant families, who had been in Siberia for generations and who had built their fortunes there, approached winter with something closer to professionalism. They understood that success in Siberia required adaptation, required taking winter seriously, rather than treating it as a temporary inconvenience. These households often developed extensive knowledge about preservation and storage, knowledge that sometimes approached or equaled what peasants possessed. The seasonal cycle of elite life in larger Siberian towns included rhythms shaped by winter's demands. Autumn was social. People hosted gatherings before winter made travel difficult, celebrated harvests, and conducted business that would be impossible once snow closed roads. Winter itself became more INSC. Families retreated into their heated homes. Social circles contracted to those living nearby. Entertainment became more private and domestic. Spring, when it finally arrived, brought an explosion of activity. Pent-up social energy released. Business resumed. The cellars and storerooms that had been so carefully managed all winter gradually emptied as fresh food became available again. The transition from stored food to fresh food was its own kind of celebration, marking survival, marking the successful completion of another winter cycle. For peasants, the seasonal cycle felt less distinct because their lives involved constant labor regardless of season. But even they experienced spring as a kind of liberation, not just from cold, but from the anxiety of managing dwindling supplies, from the calculations that had occupied every meal throughout winter, from the fear that supplies might run out before the ground thawed enough for new planting. The relationship between elite and peasant regarding food storage and winter survival reveals something fundamental about how social hierarchies operate in extreme environments. In theory, extreme environments might flatten hierarchies. Everyone faces the same challenges, so everyone should be on roughly equal footing. In practice, those with resources use them to create buffers and advantages that actually intensify hierarchical divisions. A wealthy household could make mistakes in winter preparation and survive them through purchasing or trading. A peasant household making the same mistakes might starve. This difference meant that the wealthy could afford to be less careful, less precise, less anxiously attentive to every detail. The paradox was that those who least needed perfect preparation were most able to achieve it, while those whose survival depended on perfection had the fewest resources to work with. As winter deepened and supplies dwindled in households across Siberia, the dinner tables of elite and peasant families presented vastly different scenes. In a wealthy home in February, dinner might still include multiple dishes, proper table settings, relative abundance. In a peasant home, the same February meal would be a single pot of thin soup, shared from wooden bowls, eaten with the knowledge that this might need to last until tomorrow. The contrast wasn't lost on anyone. Peasants knew, either through direct observation or through rumors and stories, how elites lived. Elites knew, at least intellectually, how peasants struggled. This knowledge created a landscape of resentment and guilt, of justification and resignation, of boundaries that were maintained partly through material difference and partly through willful ignorance of how the other half lived. And so we arrive at the end of our quiet journey through winter's long hold on the Siberian frontier, having walked alongside those who faced the coldest test that nature could devise. We've descended into cellars dug deep in frozen earth, watched potatoes being counted one by one, felt the weight of calculations that meant the difference between survival and starvation. We've met Praskovia Ivan, whose quiet genius for preservation saved lives that history never bothered to count individually, whose systems outlasted her name. We've pondered the mystery of the cold wells, those enigmatic shafts lined with spiral logs descending into permafrost to hold secrets we may never fully recover. And we've seen how winter divided the world between those who commanded abundance and those who scraped by. How the same challenge, store enough food to survive until spring, played out across vastly different landscapes of privilege and deprivation. What stays with us, perhaps, is not the specific details of how many pounds of potatoes a family needed or the precise temperature of a root cellar. What lingers is the understanding of what it meant to live with winter as a constant presence, an inescapable reality that shaped every decision from August through April. These people, peasants and nobles, women managing communal stores, and men cutting timber in frozen forests, possessed knowledge that we've largely forgotten. Knowledge earned through harsh experience and passed down through generations who had no choice but to learn it perfectly. They understood uncertainty in ways we've been privileged to forget. They knew that you could do everything right, harvest carefully, store properly, ration wisely, and still faced disaster if the weather turned wrong, if disease struck, if luck simply failed. They lived with that understanding every day, and somehow they kept planting seeds each spring, kept digging cellars deeper, kept believing that preparation and discipline and community could prevail against odds that sometimes seemed insurmountable. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, in whatever warm space holds you, consider the distance we've traveled from those frozen homesteads. Consider how you don't need to count your potatoes, don't need to descend into cold earth to retrieve dinner, don't need to ration food in February because the harvest failed in October. Consider the invisible infrastructure of refrigeration and transportation and agricultural abundance that allows you to take tomorrow's meals for granted. But consider also what was lost in that journey from scarcity to abundance. The frontier settlers possessed an attention to detail, a reverence for food, an understanding of preservation that we've surrendered along with the desperate necessity that created it. They knew the specific feel of a potato that would last through winter versus one that wouldn't. They understood fermentation as an intimate process, not an industrial mystery. They recognized that food connected them to earth and season and community in ways that extended far beyond mere nutrition. Praskovia. Ivanovna's story reminds us that survival often depended not on strength or courage, but on attention, the ability to observe carefully, to calculate accurately, to understand patterns that others missed. Her quiet leadership saved her community not through dramatic action, but through patient management, through the unglamorous work of checking cellars and distributing rations and thinking constantly about margins and variables and what-ifs. History rarely remembers such people by name, but their contributions ripple forward through all the lives they preserved, all the families that endured because someone paid attention when attention mattered. The mystery of the cold wells invites us to remain humble about what we think we know. These structures existed, served important purposes, represented sophisticated engineering and cultural practices. Yet we can only partially reconstruct their meaning and use. What other knowledge has been lost? What other ingenious solutions to fundamental problems have vanished as the people who possessed them died without passing it on completely? The cold wells stand as reminders that absence of evidence shouldn't be mistaken for evidence of absence, that folk wisdom sometimes contains sophistication that academic knowledge struggles to recognize or replicate. And the divide between elite and peasant, between those who commanded plenty and those who scraped by, reminds us that scarcity and abundance are never simply about absolute quantities. They're about power, about who controls resources and who depends on them, about systems that allocate risk and security according to hierarchies that precede and outlast any particular winter. The frontier peasant storing 200 ulwabi of potatoes and the merchant storing 2,000 faced the same winter. But they faced it from positions so different that they might as well have inhabited separate worlds. Yet winter itself remained indifferent to these human distinctions. It pressed down on rich and poor alike, demanded preparation from everyone, mocked those who underestimated it regardless of their social position. In this sense, the Siberian winter was perhaps more egalitarian than the human societies that confronted it, more honest in its requirements and consequences, more reliable in how it responded to wisdom versus foolishness. As you settle deeper into rest, let these images soften and blur. The rows of cabbage in October frost. The smoky interior of a peasant dwelling where a family counts their stores by firelight. The spiral logs of a cold well descending into frozen earth. Praskovia Ivanovna checking barrels in a communal cellar, her capable hands moving from sack to sack, her mind calculating margins of survival. The contrast between a merchant's abundant table and a peasant's thin soup, both consumed beneath the same winter stars. Let yourself feel gratitude for the distance between their world and yours. The thermostat on your wall that maintains temperature without thought or effort. The refrigerator humming in your kitchen, preserving tomorrow's food with technology that would have seemed miraculous to frontier settlers. The grocery store, where you can buy potatoes in February without having dug and stored them yourself, without having worried all winter whether your supply would last. But carry forward also a small measure of respect for those who lived without these comforts, who faced winter's full force and survived it year after year through nothing but knowledge and labor and communal support. They were not superhuman, not stronger or smarter than we are. They were simply people confronted with necessity, people who learned what they had to learn because the alternative was unthinkable. Their lives have passed into silence now. The settlements where they lived have mostly vanished, reclaimed by forest or transformed beyond recognition. The cellars they dug have collapsed. The food they stored has long since nourished bodies that themselves returned to earth decades or centuries ago. But the fact that they survived, that they learned winter's lessons well enough to pass life forward to the next generation, means that their victory over scarcity was complete, even if their names have been forgotten. Sleep now. Drift into dreams that may carry you through forests of birch and pine, past frozen rivers where ice groans and shifts in the darkness. Let winter remain at a comfortable distance, something to contemplate rather than endure, something to respect from the safety of warmth and abundance. Tomorrow will arrive with its easy plenty. But tonight, you've walked for a while in the footsteps of those for whom tomorrow was never guaranteed. And perhaps that journey has left you changed in small ways you'll discover only gradually. The cold wells keep their remaining secrets beneath Siberian soil. The systems Praskovia built have evolved beyond recognition. The division between elite and peasant has transformed into different but equally real divisions between those who have and those who need. But the fundamental challenge, how to preserve summer's abundance against winter's scarcity, remains written into the human condition. Even when modern technology masks how dependent we still are on successful solutions to that ancient problem. Rest well in your warm bed, in your climate-controlled room, in your world where winter has been largely defeated by collective human ingenuity and fossil fuel abundance. Rest well and let these stories of cold and calculation and careful management settle into your consciousness like snow accumulating silently through a long night. When you wake, the world will be much as you left it, with all its modern comforts and conveniences intact. But perhaps you'll look at your refrigerator differently, seeing it as part of a long lineage of human efforts to preserve food across time. Perhaps you'll notice the seasons more carefully, the way autumn abundance gives way to winter scarcity, even in our abundant age. Perhaps you'll think occasionally about the invisible infrastructure that delivers food to your table, and the people throughout history who solved the problem of preservation so that life could continue through the coldest, darkest, most challenging months. The Siberian winter still exists, of course, still presses down on that vast landscape with the same patient, indifferent force. But the people who face it now have different tools, different knowledge, different systems of support. They are the inheritors of all those frontier lessons, all that accumulated wisdom about survival in extreme conditions. They stand on foundations built by people like Praskovia Ivanovna, by anonymous peasants who counted potatoes in October and prayed they'd calculated correctly, by whoever first thought to dig a deep shaft into permafrost and line it with spiral logs to create a natural deep freeze. And we, comfortable in our distant homes, in our different times, benefit from that same inheritance, even if we don't recognize it. Every technique of food preservation, every insight about storage and fermentation, and how to make abundance last through scarcity, carries forward through time, adapted and improved, but rooted in the desperate necessity that drove frontier settlers to observe carefully and learn thoroughly. So, rest now, in gratitude and respect. Rest knowing that you've touched, for a brief time, a world that was harder and colder and more demanding than most of us will ever experience. Rest knowing that the people who inhabited that world were fundamentally like you, worried about tomorrow, protective of their families, hopeful that their preparations would prove sufficient, doing their best against odds that were often overwhelming. Their story is not separate from ours, but connected to it through all the threads of human continuity, all the ways that knowledge and technique and wisdom pass forward through generations. They would not recognize our world, perhaps, with all its technology and abundance, but they would recognize our fundamental desires to keep those we love safe, to prepare adequately for what's coming, to store enough to survive until better times return. Let that recognition be the last thought you carry into sleep. Across all the centuries and distances, across all the differences in technology and social organization and material conditions, the human project remains essentially unchanged, figuring out how to survive, how to preserve what matters, how to make it through winter until spring arrives again with its promise of renewal. They solved it with cellars and crocks and careful calculation. We solve it with refrigeration and global supply chains and agricultural science. But the problem they faced is the problem we still face, dressed in different clothes but fundamentally the same. Rest well. Spring will come as it always does, as it came for the frontier settlers after their longest, coldest winters. Spring will come, and with it, the renewal that makes all that winter effort worthwhile. But for now, for tonight, let winter remain in these stories, in this safe distance, in these images of people long gone who face the cold, and somehow, through knowledge and community and stubborn determination, survive to see another planting season. The fire in the stove burns low. The cellar door is secured against the cold. The stores have been counted and found adequate, or at least sufficient, or at least all that could be managed. The long night stretches ahead, but morning will eventually arrive, and with it another day of careful management, of small, rationed meals, of hope maintained against the evidence of deep snow and bitter cold. But that is their story, not yours. Your story ends here, in comfort and safety, in warmth and plenty, in a world that winter cannot truly threaten. Let their world recede now into the past, where it belongs, carried forward only in memory and respect and the occasional moment of gratitude for all the distance we've traveled. Sleep now and let the stories settle. Sleep and dream of anything but cold. Sleep and wake tomorrow to a world where food appears reliably, where winter is an inconvenience rather than a trial, where the desperate arithmetic of survival has been replaced by the easy abundance of modern life. Sleep well and rest deeply, knowing that you've honored for a brief time the memory of those who had no such luxury, who slept lightly, if at all, always listening for the sound of wind that might signal the next storm, always calculating whether their preparations would truly be enough. The end comes quietly, as it should, with no drama or resolution, beyond the simple fact of another story told. Another glimpse into lives that were harder than ours. Another reminder of how much has changed and how much remains eternally the same. Rest now in that knowledge. Rest in gratitude and comfort. Rest knowing that winter's grip, so absolute for those frontier settlers, has been loosened for you by centuries of collective human effort to solve the problem of preservation. And let that be enough. That small recognition, that brief acknowledgement of their struggle and your comfort. Let it be enough to ease you into sleep, to carry you through the night, to perhaps change slightly how you see the world when you wake. Not dramatically, not transformatively, but in the way that all good stories change us. Subtly, persistently, adding one more layer to our understanding of what it means to be human, to struggle, to survive, to hope that our efforts will prove sufficient against whatever challenges the future holds.